On January 6, 1932, a congressman from East Texas named Wright Patman rose on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and impeached Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Mellon had used the office to shield a family empire built across 3 generations from a single Pittsburgh bank into more than 300 corporations. From the taxes and regulations he was charged with enforcing, while simultaneously controlling the only aluminum monopoly in the Western Hemisphere. He had served 3 presidents, cut the top income tax rate from 73% to 24%, and was the 3rd richest man in America. But when the economy collapsed and 12 million Americans lost their jobs, the machinery of his power became the evidence against him. The story of how one immigrant family rose from a farmhouse in County Tyrone, Ireland, to control the Treasury of the United States, and what it cost the country when that control was exposed, begins in 1813. Thomas Mellon was born on the 3rd of February, 1813, in a stone cottage at Castletown in the parish of Kappa, near the town of Omagh in County Tyrone. His parents were farmers, Scots-Irish Presbyterians whose families had settled in Ulster in the middle of the 17th century. The land they worked was marginal, the prospects narrow. In 1818, when Thomas was 5 years old, his father gathered the family and sailed for western Pennsylvania, where Mellon relatives had already established themselves in Westmoreland County. They settled on a farm near a crossroads that local people called Poverty Point. The name was accurate. The Mellons farmed. Thomas worked the fields alongside his father and expected to continue doing so until, at the age of 14, he came upon a copy of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. The book struck him like a conversion. Franklin's account of a poor boy's ascent through discipline, frugality, and relentless self-improvement mapped precisely onto the Scots-Irish Presbyterian ethic that governed the Mellon household, but it offered a destination the farm did not. Thomas later wrote that reading Franklin's story made him feel lifted above the mud and drudgery of rural life. At 17, he left the farm for the classroom. He enrolled at the Western University of Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, the institution now known as the University of Pittsburgh, and emerged with a degree that carried him into the law. He opened a private practice in Pittsburgh and turned immediately to the work that interested him more than jurisprudence, which was the systematic accumulation of property. He invested his legal fees, methodically, in the 2 commodities that Pittsburgh's industrial expansion was making profitable above all others. He acquired coal fields south of the city and commercial lots along the downtown corridors where iron foundries, glass factories, and river freight companies were clustering. Pittsburgh in the 1840s sat at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, a natural gateway to the interior of the continent, and the railroads were just arriving to connect its furnaces to eastern markets. Thomas Mellon understood, with the instinct of a man who had studied Franklin, that the furnace would need fuel, and the workers who fed it would need places to live. In 1843, he married Sarah Jane Negley, the daughter of a distinguished landed family in the Pittsburgh area. The Negleys owned substantial property in East Liberty, and the marriage brought Thomas both social standing and a second source of capital. The couple had 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. Andrew Mellon, born on the 24th of March, 1855, was the 3rd surviving son. In 1859, Thomas was elected Associate Judge of the Court of Common Pleas for Allegheny County. He served a decade on the bench, building both his reputation and his network of contacts among Pittsburgh's industrialists and Republican politicians. From the courtroom, he watched the economic transformation of western Pennsylvania accelerate through the Civil War years, as iron production expanded to supply the Union Army and the first great fortunes of Pittsburgh began to take shape around him. The judgeship brought him influence, his investments brought him wealth, and his temperament, a combination of Presbyterian severity and forensic caution, brought a clarity about risk that would prove more valuable than either. He retired from the bench in 1869, and the following year, with his sons Andrew and Richard beside him, he opened T. Mellon and Sons, bankers, at 145 Smithfield Street in downtown Pittsburgh. Above the front door, Thomas placed a bronze statue of Benjamin Franklin. The figure stood there for the next 50 years, watching the city grow around the institution that bore the Mellon name. The bank's first crisis arrived almost immediately. The financial panic of 1873 swept through American banking with the force of a prairie fire, collapsing railroad companies, shuttering factories, and destroying dozens of smaller banks across Pennsylvania. J. Cook and Company, the most powerful private bank in the country, failed on the 18th of September. Within weeks, the New York Stock Exchange closed its doors for 10 days, and the panic radiated outward through every commercial center in the nation. Thomas Mellon survived it. His method was the same method that would define the family for the next 3 generations. He refused to speculate, refused to overextend, and lent only to borrowers whose collateral could be seized and whose enterprises he understood well enough to operate himself if they failed. While competitors folded, the Mellon Bank absorbed their customers and their deposits. Andrew Mellon, 18 years old during the panic, had already sensed what was coming. His father had set him up in a small building supply business to teach him practical commerce, and Andrew, reading the market with a precision that startled his father, liquidated the enterprise and pulled out his capital just before the crash hit. It was the first evidence of a talent that would define him, an instinct for sensing a collapse before it arrived and positioning himself on the right side of it. One loan from this period would alter the trajectory of American industry. Thomas advanced $10,000 to a young coke producer named Henry Clay Frick. Frick used the money to buy up coke ovens in the Connellsville region of western Pennsylvania at distressed prices during the panic, building a supply network that would become indispensable to Andrew Carnegie's expanding steel operation. The coke that Frick produced, financed by Mellon Capital, fueled the furnaces that made Carnegie the richest man in the world. The Mellon-Frick alliance, cemented by that single loan, would endure for decades and underwrite a substantial portion of Pittsburgh's industrial architecture. By the time Thomas Mellon retired in 1882 and transferred the bank's operations to his sons Andrew and Richard, the institution on Smithfield Street had become the financial center of western Pennsylvania. It had survived 2 national panics. It had financed the region's largest coke producer, its most productive coal mines, and a growing portfolio of real estate holdings that stretched across Allegheny County. Thomas himself had accumulated a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest citizens of Pittsburgh, a city that was rapidly becoming one of the wealthiest cities in the world. The scale of what Thomas Mellon built from a farm in Poverty Point is worth measuring precisely. By 1882, T. Mellon and Sons held assets that made it the dominant lending institution in Pittsburgh and the largest bank in the country outside of New York. The Frick loan alone had helped produce a coke empire of more than 1,000 ovens that supplied the raw material for Carnegie Steel, the largest steel maker on earth. Thomas owned coal interests across southwestern Pennsylvania and commercial real estate in the neighborhoods where Pittsburgh's industrial workforce was doubling every decade. He had financed glass factories, iron foundries, and the early infrastructure of a city whose annual industrial output already rivaled Philadelphia's. He had arrived in the country at the age of 5 with no money and no English. He lived to 95, dying on the 3rd of February, 1908, the same year Henry Ford introduced the Model T. He had outlived the frontier, the Civil War, two financial panics, and the Gilded Age, and he left behind not merely a fortune, but a mechanism for compounding it. Thomas wrote extensively in his later years. His autobiography, completed in 1885, is a remarkable document of Scott's Irish ambition and capitalist conviction. In it, he described himself as a man who held a horror of monopoly. He believed that concentrated economic power corrupted both the holder and the republic. He wrote with genuine anxiety about the trusts and combinations that were reorganizing American industry in the 1880s, and he cautioned his sons against the temptation of dominance. His sons read the autobiography. They admired their father's discipline, his caution, and his severity. But the horror of monopoly did not survive the generation. Andrew Mellon was 27 years old when his father retired. He was quiet, precise, and socially withdrawn, a man who communicated more fluently through ledgers than through conversation. He had spent every Saturday of his university years inside the bank at Smithfield Street, absorbing its rhythms. His father had taught him to lend carefully, to evaluate collateral before character, and to take equity in the enterprises he financed rather than merely collecting interest. Andrew had internalized every lesson, and in the decade after his father stepped aside, he would apply those lessons at a scale and with a ferocity that Thomas Mellon would not have recognized. He had begun. Andrew Mellon's method was deceptively simple, and he had learned it from his father. A promising enterprise would approach the bank on Smithfield Street in need of capital. Mellon would evaluate the venture with the detachment of a surgeon, examining its patents, its markets, and its management. If the enterprise passed his inspection, he would extend a loan. But the loan was never merely a loan. Mellon took equity, he took seats on the board, and if the venture succeeded, he took control. The relationship between banker and borrower, in the hands of Andrew Mellon, was a one-way corridor. Capital flowed outward. Ownership flowed back. Between 1882 and 1890, Andrew transformed the family bank from a regional lending house into something closer to a venture capital operation, decades before that term existed. He did not wait for borrowers to come to him. He studied emerging industries, identified the enterprises with the strongest patent positions and the weakest balance sheets, and offered capital on terms that ensured the Mellons would share in whatever the enterprise produced. His father had lent money to men he could evaluate face-to-face across a desk in Pittsburgh. Andrew was prepared to finance technologies he had never seen in industries that did not yet have names on the strength of a patent filing and a balance sheet. In 1889, 2 years before Thomas Mellon died, a small company called the Pittsburgh Reduction Company came to the Mellon Bank in desperate need of financing. The company had been founded the previous year by a young chemist named Charles Martin Hall and a metallurgist named Alfred Ephraim Hunt, and it occupied a modest pilot plant on Smallman Street in Pittsburgh's Strip District. Hall had made a discovery that had eluded chemists for decades. On the 23rd of February, 1886, working alone in a woodshed behind his family's home in Oberlin, Ohio, with equipment he had built himself and chemicals he had prepared by hand, Hall had passed an electric current through a bath of aluminum oxide dissolved in molten cryolite. When the current stopped, small globules of pure aluminum metal sat at the bottom of the crucible. His sister Julia witnessed the experiment the following day. The discovery was transformative because aluminum, at that moment in history, was essentially a precious metal. It was abundant in the Earth's crust, but ruinously expensive to extract. In the 1880s, refined aluminum sold for approximately $12 per pound, a price that placed it alongside silver. Napoleon III had reportedly served state dinners on aluminum plates, while lesser guests ate from gold. The metal was light, strong, resistant to corrosion, and almost impossibly costly to produce. Hall's electrolytic process changed the economics overnight. By passing current through the cryolite solution, he could extract aluminum at a fraction of the old cost. A Frenchman named Paul Héroult had independently discovered the same process at almost the same time, and the method would come to bear both their names. But it was Hall who found financing in Pittsburgh, and it was the Mellon Bank that provided it. Andrew Mellon recognized what the Pittsburgh Reduction Company represented. The Hall process was protected by patent. No competitor could legally replicate it. The demand for a lightweight, corrosion-resistant metal in a nation that was building railroads, telegraph lines, and electrical infrastructure was, by any reasonable projection, enormous. And the company that controlled the only viable process for producing that metal at industrial scale would control not just a product, but an element. Mellon extended the loan. He took a substantial equity stake. He took financial control. The company's founders, Hall and Hunt, remained in operational roles, but the financial architecture of the enterprise now ran through the Mellon Bank. The company's first commercial pour of aluminum took place on Thanksgiving Day, 1888, in the Smallman Street plant. Arthur Vining Davis, a recent graduate of Amherst College whose father knew Alfred Hunt, had been hired as Hall's assistant. Davis and Hall worked 12-hour shifts together for months, refining the smelting equipment and improving the purity of the output. The aluminum that emerged from the crucible on that November afternoon was impure by later standards, but it was real, and it was cheap. By 1893, the price of aluminum had fallen from nearly $5 per pound to 78 cents. By 1914, it would reach 18 cents. The trajectory was clear, and Andrew Mellon positioned himself along its entire length. In 1891, the company moved its production from the cramped Smallman Street facility to a larger plant at New Kensington, 17 miles up the Allegheny River from Pittsburgh. In 1894, it acquired its first bauxite mining rights through a venture called the Georgia Bauxite Company, securing control over the raw ore from which aluminum oxide was refined. In 1895, it established a reduction operation at Niagara Falls, New York, where the massive hydroelectric generating stations along the gorge of the Niagara River could supply the enormous volumes of electricity that the Hall process demanded. The ALCOA plant at Niagara occupied the high bank above the gorge, its towers dominating the industrial skyline north of the falls, drawing power from the same cataracts that had awed tourists for a century. Aluminum smelting consumed more electricity per ton than any other industrial process in existence, and access to cheap hydroelectric power was the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The Pittsburgh Reduction Company did not merely purchase that power. Over time, it built its own generating stations along the rivers of Tennessee and North Carolina, securing exclusive contracts that locked competitors out of the energy supply they would have needed to enter the market. Richard Mellon, Andrew's younger brother, served as president of the Pittsburgh Reduction Company from 1899 to 1910. The two brothers operated in complementary registers. Andrew managed the financial architecture from the bank. Richard managed the industrial operations from the plant floor. Together, they constructed a monopoly of a kind that American industry had rarely seen, not through the predatory tactics that had defined Standard Oil or the pricing wars that had consolidated steel, but through the quieter and more durable mechanism of vertical integration. The company mined its own bauxite in Georgia and Arkansas. It refined that bauxite into alumina at its own processing plants. It smelted the alumina into aluminum ingots at its own reduction works, powered by its own hydroelectric stations at Niagara Falls and along the rivers of Tennessee and North Carolina. It fabricated those ingots into finished products, including sheet metal, tubing, cable, wire, and cookware, at its own rolling mills and extrusion plants. And it sold those products to manufacturers who had no alternative domestic supplier. Every link in the chain, from ore in the ground to finished metal in the customer's hands, belonged to the same company, controlled by the same family, financed by the same bank. In 1907, Andrew Mellon took full personal control of the enterprise and renamed it the Aluminum Company of America. The name would contract, in common usage, to ALCOA. By that year, the company employed thousands of workers across multiple states and had become the largest single consumer of hydroelectric power in the nation. The federal government noticed. In 1912, the Department of Justice filed its first antitrust suit against ALCOA, alleging monopolistic practices, including restrictive covenants with suppliers that prevented those suppliers from selling to potential competitors. The case was settled in 1912, with ALCOA agreeing to cancel its exclusive supply contracts and to refrain from participating in foreign cartels. The consent decree was, in practical terms, a slap on the wrist. The company retained its monopoly position, its vertical integration, and its control over the raw materials, energy supply, and fabrication capacity that made competition functionally impossible. The settlement removed the formal barriers to entry. The structural barriers remained untouched. The scale of the monopoly that ALCOA represented by the end of its first 2 decades is worth pausing to absorb. The company controlled 100% of domestic aluminum refining in the United States. It held 90% of the market for aluminum sheet, tubing, cable, and wire. It generated its own hydroelectric power at plants along the Niagara Gorge, the Tennessee River, and the rivers of the Carolina Mountains. It owned the bauxite mines, the alumina refineries, the smelters, the fabrication plants, and the power stations. Its patents had locked competitors out of the American market for more than 3 decades. The protective tariff on imported aluminum, which the federal government maintained throughout this period, ensured that no foreign producer could undercut ALCOA's domestic prices. During the First World War, ALCOA increased its production by 40% to meet the demands of the American military, supplying aluminum for aircraft frames, engine components, and munitions casings. The war made aluminum a strategic material, and ALCOA was the only domestic company that could provide it. No single firm in American history had ever dominated an element of the periodic table the way ALCOA dominated aluminum. Standard Oil had controlled the flow of petroleum. Carnegie Steel had dominated an industry. ALCOA controlled a substance. The Hall patent would expire eventually, but by the time it did, ALCOA had built a fortress of vertical integration so complete, so interlocking, that the absence of patent protection scarcely mattered. A competitor entering the aluminum market in 1910 would have needed to locate bauxite deposits, build a refinery, construct a smelter, secure an enormous supply of hydroelectric power, and develop a distribution network, all while competing against a company that already possessed every one of those assets and had spent 2 decades driving costs below any price a newcomer could match. The barrier was no longer legal. It was structural. Andrew Mellon did not boast about the monopoly. He did not make speeches defending it or write pamphlets justifying it. He conducted the entire operation with the same temperament he brought to the bank on Smithfield Street, which was the temperament of a man who regarded silence as a competitive advantage. When pressed by a senator about the absence of competitors in the aluminum market, Mellon is said to have replied that the market was open to anyone with the enterprise to enter it. The remark carried the dry precision of a man who understood exactly what that enterprise would require and how unlikely it was that anyone would undertake it. The aluminum monopoly would make Andrew Mellon one of the 3 richest men in America. But it would do something else as well, something that neither Thomas Mellon's autobiography nor Benjamin Franklin's had contemplated. It would follow him into the United States Treasury and sit beside him at the table where the nation's tariff rates, tax policies, and industrial regulations were written. The man who set the tariff on imported aluminum would be the man who profited from that tariff. The man who oversaw the Bureau of Internal Revenue would be the man whose companies filed the largest returns. The monopoly would become more than a source of wealth. In time, it would become a conflict of interest so comprehensive that a congressman from East Texas would call it a crime. But the aluminum monopoly was not the only instrument in Andrew Mellon's growing empire. In the same years that ALCOA was consolidating its hold on American aluminum, Mellon was extending his reach into oil, steel, and the financial system itself. Andrew Mellon had commandeered an element. On the 10th of January, 1901, a drilling rig near the town of Beaumont in southeastern Texas struck a salt dome formation that sent a column of crude oil more than 100 feet into the air. The Spindletop Gusher, as it came to be known, produced between 75,000 and 100,000 barrels of oil per day at its peak, more than any well in American history. The discovery transformed Texas into the center of the American petroleum industry overnight, and the men who controlled the leases around Spindletop suddenly needed capital on a scale that the Texas wildcatters who had drilled the well could not provide. The financing came from Pittsburgh. James M. Guffey and John H. Gailey, experienced oil men who held the rights to the Spindletop property, had arranged their backing through the Mellons. Andrew and Richard Mellon led an investment syndicate that purchased shares in the J. M. Guffey Petroleum Company, organized in May of 1901. A separate firm, the Gulf Refining Company, was established later that year with new capital to build a refinery at Port Arthur, Texas. By the summer of 1902, more than $6 million had been invested in the 2 companies, approximately half of which had been provided by the Mellon family. Guffey proved to be a better wildcatter than administrator. Production at Spindletop began to decline, costs mounted, and the operation drifted toward insolvency. The Mellons responded as they always did. They removed Guffey from operational control and installed William Larimer Mellon, Andrew's nephew, as the active head of the enterprise. In 1907, the various Guffey and Gulf companies were reorganized under a single corporate structure named the Gulf Oil Corporation, with Andrew Mellon holding the controlling interest. Gulf Oil would grow into one of the 7 largest oil companies in the world, its Art Deco headquarters tower rising above the Pittsburgh skyline as the tallest building in the city until 1970. The oil company joined an industrial portfolio that was expanding in every direction. In 1889, Andrew Mellon and Henry Clay Frick had organized the Union Trust Company, which became Mellon's principal financial instrument, absorbing the family bank and centralizing the financial power of Pittsburgh within a single institution. In 1899, Mellon and Frick co-founded the Union Steel Company, which competed directly with the industry leader, United States Steel. Union Steel later merged with U.S. Steel, contributing to the formation of the largest steel producer on Earth. Between 1898 and 1902, a flood of corporate mergers swept through Pittsburgh, most of them engineered by Andrew Mellon and nearly all of them financed through his bank. Within 10 years of taking control of Union Trust, Andrew had made it the center of financial gravity in a city that produced more steel, more glass, and more coke than any other city in the Western Hemisphere. The portfolio continued to accumulate. Copper's Company, which produced coke, gas, and chemical byproducts from coal, turning the waste products of the steel industry into a separate revenue stream. The Carborundum Company, which manufactured synthetic abrasives at its plants in Niagara Falls using the same hydroelectric power that fed the ALCOA smelters. The New York Shipbuilding Company, which built warships and commercial vessels at its yards in Camden, New Jersey, and which held contracts with the United States Navy. The Pittsburgh Coal Company, where Richard Mellon clashed repeatedly with John L. Lewis and the United Mine Workers over wages and working conditions in the southwestern Pennsylvania coal fields. By 1920, Andrew Mellon held a dominant position in more than 60 corporations. The Mellon National Bank, as the institution on Smithfield Street was now called, had become the largest banking house in the country outside of New York, and its influence reached into every significant industry that Western Pennsylvania produced. The empire's architecture was distinctive. Andrew Mellon did not operate like John D. Rockefeller, who had built Standard Oil through a single monolithic structure that controlled every stage of production in a single industry. Mellon operated more like J.P. Morgan, financing enterprises across multiple industries and binding them to a single financial center through equity, debt, and board seats. But Mellon lacked Morgan's appetite for publicity and his taste for personal confrontation. Where Morgan entered a room and expected it to rearrange itself around him, Mellon entered a room and hoped not to be noticed. His power was structural, not theatrical. It lived in ledgers, in share certificates, and in the quiet arithmetic of compounding interest. It was during the most productive decade of this expansion that Andrew Mellon made the only decision in his adult life that was not governed by calculation. In 1900, aboard a transatlantic steamer, Henry Clay Frick introduced the 45-year-old banker to a 20-year-old Englishwoman named Nora Mary McMullen. Nora was the daughter of Alexander McMullen, a prosperous brewer whose family operated McMullen and Sons, one of the largest breweries in Hertfordshire. She was beautiful, charming, and outgoing. Mellon, who had spent 2 decades avoiding social engagements and communicating primarily through balance sheets, fell immediately and unreservedly in love. He proposed. She refused. "You must see it is a mistake," Nora wrote to him. "It would mean nothing but unhappiness for us both." There was a 25-year age difference. Her life was the English countryside, the hunting parties, the broad green lawns. His was the smoke and grit of industrial Pittsburgh, the 12-hour days at the bank, the silence of a house furnished for work rather than companionship. His own father had counseled against it. Her parents had reservations. But Andrew Mellon, who in every other domain of his life exercised the patience of a man who knew how to wait for an opportunity to mature, pursued Nora McMullen with a persistence that obliterated every objection. They married in September of 1900. The trouble began on the train home. When the newlyweds stepped off at East Liberty Station in Pittsburgh, Nora looked at the industrial landscape that surrounded her husband's mansion and said, "According to accounts that have survived in the family, we don't get off here, do we?" The mystique of Andrew Mellon's wealth had not prepared her for the reality of Andrew Mellon's city. A daughter, Ailsa, was born in 1901. Nora grew despondent. She was ill with ailments her doctors could not diagnose. She languished in the mansion while Andrew returned to his obsessive work at the bank. On a trip back to England, she met a man named Alfred Curfey, a former military officer who had served in the Boer War and whom several contemporary accounts described as a practiced seducer of the wives of wealthy men. Nora fell for him completely. She spent as much time in England as Andrew would permit, and Mellon, without realizing it, was financing Curfee's lifestyle along with the expenses of Nora's 4 idle brothers. When Mellon discovered the affair, he responded not with confrontation, but with the instrument he understood best. He paid Curfee £20,000 to agree to abandon Nora. The payment bought enough time for a second child, Paul, to be born in 1907. But Curfee, having exhausted the Mellon payoff, returned. Nora demanded an allowance of $20,000 per year, most of it earmarked for Curfee. In 1909, she demanded a divorce outright. In 1910, Andrew filed on grounds of adultery. The proceedings dragged on for 2 years, exposing the most private man in American industry to the most public humiliation of his life. The divorce was granted in 1912. Andrew Mellon, who had dismantled competitors and absorbed entire industries without raising his voice, had been unable to hold together a marriage. The scale of the empire that Andrew Mellon had assembled by the time his marriage ended is worth measuring against the landscape of American wealth. 5 companies that would later appear on the Fortune 500 list owed their existence directly to Mellon Capital and Mellon Management. ALCOA, Gulf Oil, Mellon National Bank, Carborundum, and Coppers. He controlled a network of 99 banks. He held interests in more than 300 corporations engaged in domestic and international commerce. He was the 3rd highest income taxpayer in the United States, behind only John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. His personal fortune was estimated between $300 million and $400 million, equivalent to more than $5 billion in modern currency. And he was 57 years old, newly divorced, raising 2 children with the help of servants, with no public life outside the walls of the Mellon National Bank. In 1921, the newly inaugurated President of the United States, Warren Gamaliel Harding, offered this man the position of Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. The salary was $12,000 a year. Mellon accepted. He left Pittsburgh for Washington, and the empire he had built followed him there. He accepted. Andrew Mellon arrived in Washington in March of 1921 as a figure so wealthy and so private that much of the capital had never heard of him. He was 65 years old, slight of frame, with a gray mustache and the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades avoiding public attention. His daughter Ailsa, 20 years old and unmarried, accompanied him to serve as his official hostess, since his divorce from Nora 9 years earlier had left him without a wife to manage the social obligations that accompanied a cabinet position. Ailsa would fill this role for the entire duration of her father's time in Washington, presiding over dinners and receptions in the apartment they shared, a woman of considerable beauty and near total reserve, who had inherited both her father's fortune and his temperament. The press described Mellon himself as the most retiring man ever to hold a major post in the federal government. The description was accurate and, as events would demonstrate, insufficient. President Harding had been looking for a Treasury Secretary who could manage the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy, and Mellon's reputation as the most successful financier west of New York made him the obvious candidate. The appointment was controversial from the start. Progressive senators objected that Mellon's vast business holdings created an inherent conflict of interest. Conservative senators and the business press countered that Mellon's wealth was proof of his competence, and that the country needed a businessman, not a politician, at the Treasury. The conservatives prevailed. Mellon was confirmed on the 4th of March, 1921, the same day Harding was inaugurated. The position of Secretary of the Treasury carried with it, under the original provisions of the Federal Reserve Act, the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve Board. Andrew Mellon thus assumed, on a single day, control of the nation's tax policy, its monetary policy, and its banking regulation. He oversaw the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which processed the tax returns of every corporation and individual in the country. He oversaw the Bureau of Customs, which administered the tariffs that determined how foreign goods competed with domestic products. He oversaw the enforcement of Prohibition, which had been the law of the land since January of 1920. And he continued to hold, despite a statutory prohibition against the Treasury Secretary engaging in trade or commerce, interests in more than 300 corporations, including the largest aluminum monopoly in the Western Hemisphere, one of the 7 largest oil companies in the world, and the largest bank in Pittsburgh. The statute that should have prevented his appointment was Section 243 of Title V of the United States Code. It read, in relevant part, that no person appointed to the office of Secretary of the Treasury shall directly or indirectly be concerned or interested in carrying on the business of trade or commerce. Mellon claimed that he had transferred his holdings to his brother Richard and to various trusts before taking office. The transfers were, by most accounts, nominal. The businesses continued to operate as they had before, the profits continued to flow to the same family, and Andrew Mellon continued to make decisions in Washington that affected every industry in which the Mellon Empire held a stake. His first order of business was taxes. When Mellon took office, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States stood at 73%, a wartime rate enacted to finance the American effort in the First World War. Mellon considered this rate confiscatory and economically destructive. He argued in a book titled Taxation, The People's Business, published in 1924, that excessive tax rates drove capital into tax-exempt securities and out of productive enterprise, reducing both economic growth and government revenue. The remedy, as Mellon saw it, was to reduce rates dramatically, particularly on the highest incomes, in order to attract capital back into the economy where it could be taxed at the lower rate. The argument was, in its essentials, what a later generation would call supply-side economics. Mellon pressed Congress relentlessly, and Congress, persuaded by a combination of Mellon's reputation, the improving economy, and the lobbying of the business interests that Mellon represented, yielded. The Revenue Act of 1921 lowered the top rate modestly. The Revenue Act of 1924 cut it further. The Revenue Act of 1926 cut it further still. By 1929, after a 6th round of tax legislation, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States had fallen from 73% to 24%. Those in the lowest income brackets saw their rates fall as well, and so many exemptions were introduced that the number of Americans who paid any federal income tax at all declined by approximately 1 million. The press celebrated the results. The economy expanded through the middle years of the decade with a vigor that appeared to confirm everything Mellon had argued. Industrial production rose. Automobile sales doubled, construction boomed in the cities. Unemployment fell to 4% by 1925, on its way to a low of 3%. The national debt, which had stood at more than $25 billion at the end of the war, declined steadily under Mellon's management. Federal revenue actually increased despite the lower rates, a result that Mellon attributed to the return of capital from tax-exempt shelters into productive, taxable investment. He was called the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton, a comparison he did nothing to discourage. He admired Hamilton and modeled his approach on what he understood as Hamilton's conviction that the federal government should create conditions favorable to private capital and then stand aside. Mellon also worked to repeal the federal estate tax entirely, though Congress reduced it only from 40% to 20%, a compromise that Mellon accepted with visible displeasure. The difficulty, which the press did not examine with sufficient care during the boom years, was that the man setting the nation's tax rates was simultaneously the man who benefited most directly from lowering them. Mellon was the third highest income taxpayer in the United States. Every reduction in the top marginal rate increased the after-tax income of Andrew Mellon and of the corporations he controlled. The conflict was structural and comprehensive, and it extended well beyond taxation. As Secretary of the Treasury and Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Mellon held bank stocks. As the overseer of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, he approved tax refunds that flowed to his own companies. As the administrator of customs and tariff policy, he maintained the protective tariff on imported aluminum that shielded ALCOA from foreign competition. Senator George Norris of Nebraska, one of the leading progressives in the chamber, noted that ALCOA had openly threatened to move its production to Canada if the tariff were lowered, and that the threat amounted to economic coercion of the United States Congress by a corporation controlled by the Secretary of the Treasury. The self-dealing extended to corners of the government that seemed at first glance unrelated to Mellon's business interests. The Treasury Department published a magazine that promoted the use of aluminum in the construction of government buildings, at a time when the only domestic supplier of aluminum was ALCOA, and the controlling shareholder of ALCOA was the Secretary of the Treasury. The department approved government construction contracts that specified aluminum components manufactured by ALCOA for federal buildings across the country. Regulatory capture, the process by which an industry comes to control the government agency that is supposed to regulate it, had in this case been accomplished not through lobbying or corruption, but through the simple expedient of placing the industry's owner in the regulator's chair. And then there was the whiskey. Andrew Mellon, along with Henry Clay Frick, had owned the old Overholt Distillery in West Overton, Pennsylvania, one of the largest and most respected rye whiskey producers in the country. The distillery had been in operation since 1800, when Henry Overholt and his family had settled along Jacobs Creek in Westmoreland County and begun distilling rye from the local grain. Frick had acquired a share through family connections, and Mellon had bought in alongside him. When Frick died in December of 1919, he left his share to Mellon, making Mellon the majority owner of the distillery on the eve of Prohibition. As Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon was responsible for administering the system of medicinal whiskey licenses that permitted a small number of distilleries to continue selling whiskey to pharmacists during the Prohibition era. His own distillery received one of those licenses. The man charged with enforcing the ban on alcohol sales had granted his own company a permit to sell whiskey. Under pressure from prohibitionists, Mellon eventually sold his interest in the distillery in 1925, but for 4 years the arrangement had stood undisturbed. The scale of the conflict that Andrew Mellon embodied during his 11 years at the Treasury is worth stating in full. He set the income tax rate and was among the 3 largest taxpayers in the country. He chaired the Federal Reserve Board and held bank stocks throughout his tenure. He oversaw the Bureau of Internal Revenue and approved refunds to his own companies. He administered the tariff and maintained the rate that protected his aluminum monopoly. He published government materials promoting a product manufactured exclusively by his company. He enforced prohibition and held a license to sell whiskey. He sat at the intersection of every major economic policy lever in the federal government, and every lever he pulled enriched the empire he had built in Pittsburgh. In May of 1929, 4 progressive senators issued a public statement declaring that Mellon controls some of the most gigantic financial operations in the world, and that it would be impossible to find in the United States a single citizen who has a greater interest in the business of trade or commerce. They argued that the old anti-corruption statute disqualified him from holding office. In the boom years, the argument had no traction. The economy was growing. Wages were rising. The stock market was climbing to heights that no market in history had reached. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had stood at 63 points when Mellon took office in 1921, surpassed 380 points by the late summer of 1929. Mellon's defenders pointed to the prosperity and attributed it to his policies. The press agreed. The public, inasmuch as it paid attention, was satisfied. Mellon himself appeared to believe, or at least to argue, that the system he had built was self-correcting. He told audiences that economic laws were immutable and could not be evaded. Just as labor cannot be forced to work against its will, he wrote, so it can be taken for granted that capital will not work unless the return is worthwhile. Great wealth, in Mellon's formulation, was not merely tolerable but necessary, and any attempt to curtail it through government policy would ultimately fail. But prosperity, as the Mellons had learned in the Panic of 1873 and again in the recession of the early 1890s, was not a permanent condition. The speculative excesses that Mellon's low tax rates and loose monetary policies had enabled were building pressure in every corner of the financial system. And the architecture of power that Mellon had constructed at the Treasury, the fusion of private interest and public authority that the progressives had warned against, would become far more visible once the economy it was supposed to serve stopped cooperating. On the 24th of October, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The architecture held. The economy did not. The crash did not arrive all at once. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 13% on the 28th and 29th of October, 1929, in 2 days of trading that obliterated more wealth than the entire federal budget. But the deeper collapse unfolded over the next 3 years, in a long deterioration that erased nearly 90% of the market's value and carried the American economy into the worst contraction in its history. Andrew Mellon's response to the crisis became, in the years that followed, one of the most widely quoted and most bitterly debated statements ever attributed to a public official. According to Herbert Hoover, writing in his memoirs years after the fact, Mellon advised the president to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. The downturn, in Mellon's reported view, would purge the rottenness out of the system, and the economy would emerge stronger on the other side. People will work harder, Mellon supposedly told Hoover. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. Whether Mellon used precisely those words has been debated by historians. Hoover wrote the passage long after leaving office, and he had reason to cast Mellon as an extremist in order to portray himself, by contrast, as a pragmatist who had tried to act. Mellon's own public speeches from the period contain nothing so blunt. But the substance of the position, that the government should refrain from intervening in the contraction and allow the market to correct itself, was consistent with everything Mellon had argued and believed throughout his career. The man who had told voters that economic laws were immutable and that capital would not work unless the return was worthwhile was unlikely to have abandoned those convictions at the moment they were most severely tested. As the Depression deepened through 1930 and 1931, the human consequences of Mellon's philosophy became impossible to ignore. Unemployment, which had stood at 3% during the boom, climbed past 8 million and continued rising. Bread lines formed outside churches and municipal buildings in every major city. In Pittsburgh, the city that Mellon's bank had financed and his industries had built, the unemployment rate among steelworkers exceeded 50%. Families lost their homes and their farms. Shanty towns that the press called Hoovervilles appeared in vacant lots and along railroad tracks from New York to California. Banks failed by the hundreds, then by the thousands, wiping out the savings of depositors who had trusted their money to the same financial system that Mellon had overseen. Industrial production fell by more than half, and the Secretary of the Treasury, the man who had designed the economic architecture of the 1920s and been celebrated as the greatest financial mind since Hamilton, offered no remedy, no adjustment, and no acknowledgement that the policies he had championed might have contributed to the catastrophe. Mellon favored raising interest rates to curtail speculation, a remedy that amounted to treating a hemorrhage by tightening the tourniquet until the limb died. He opposed direct relief for the unemployed. He opposed government stimulus. He opposed any deviation from the principle that markets, left alone, would find their own equilibrium. The principle had served him well for 4 decades, and he appeared to regard the Depression not as a refutation of his philosophy, but as confirmation of it. The rottenness, as he saw it, was being purged. The pain was the cure. The political climate shifted with the force of a tide reversal. In the midterm elections of 1930, the Democratic Party retook control of the House of Representatives for the first time in more than a decade. The new majority included a significant contingent of progressives and populists who had been building a case against Mellon for years. The most determined among them was a second-term congressman from the 1st District of Texas named Wright Patman. Patman was not a man who shared Andrew Mellon's background, his temperament, or his convictions. He had been born near the town of Hughes Springs in Cass County, Texas, in 1893. He had served in the United States Army during the First World War, returned to East Texas, earned a law degree from Cumberland University, and worked as a district attorney and state legislator before winning his congressional seat in 1928. He was a populist in the tradition of William Jennings Bryan, a man who believed that the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few families and institutions was the central threat to American democracy, and he had arrived in Washington with the specific intention of confronting the kind of power that Andrew Mellon represented. He had been threatening to impeach the Treasury Secretary for more than a year. Few in Washington had taken the threat seriously. Mellon had survived progressive challenges throughout the 20s, shielded by the prosperity that his policies appeared to have produced. The economy's collapse stripped that shield away. The impeachment effort represented something larger than one congressman's campaign against one cabinet member. It was, as historians would later observe, a collision between 2 opposing philosophies of government. At one end stood Mellon, who embodied the conservative republicanism of the 1920s, the conviction that the government's role was to facilitate private enterprise and then withdraw. At the other end stood Patman, who represented the populist progressive belief that government existed to restrain private power and protect the public from its excesses. The Depression had settled the argument in the court of public opinion, but the formal reckoning had not yet taken place. On the 6th of January, 1932, Wright Patman rose on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. The gallery was full. The chamber was attentive. Patman, a compact man with the bearing of a trial lawyer, addressed the speaker and delivered the words that the flash-forward hook of this story opened with. "On my own responsibility as a member of this House," Patman declared, "I impeach Andrew William Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. He spoke for an hour. Page boys moved through the chamber like shadows, rushing for law books and reference volumes as Patman laid out the charges with the precision of the county prosecutor he had once been. He began with the old anti-corruption statute, Section 243, which prohibited the Treasury Secretary from being involved in trade or commerce. He then built outward, charge by charge. Mellon had given his own companies tax refunds through the Bureau of Internal Revenue. He had held bank stocks while serving as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He had maintained the aluminum tariff that protected ALCOA while overseeing the tariff system. He had owned a distillery while enforcing Prohibition. He had published a government magazine promoting aluminum architecture while controlling the sole domestic aluminum producer. He had retained control, if not formal ownership, of more than 300 corporations engaged in global commerce while occupying the office that regulated all of them. The basic accusation was self-dealing on a scale that the Republic had never before confronted. Mellon had not merely failed to divest. He had used the machinery of the Treasury Department to enrich the empire he had brought with him from Pittsburgh. The public mood had turned. The rhyme that Mellon's own son would later recall seeing, scrawled on a urinal wall at a rest stop between Pittsburgh and Washington, captured the national sentiment with an economy that Patman's hour-long speech could not match. "Mellon pulled the whistle," it read. "Hoover rang the bell. Wall Street gave the signal, and the country went to hell." President Hoover moved quickly to neutralize the crisis. He could not afford a public impeachment trial of his Treasury Secretary in an election year, with the economy in ruins and his own re-election already in doubt. The impeachment proceedings, if allowed to continue, would produce weeks of testimony about the intersection of Mellon's private interests and public duties, testimony that would damage not just Mellon, but the entire Republican Party and the philosophy of business-government partnership that it had championed throughout the decade. Hoover offered Mellon the position of United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, the most prestigious diplomatic appointment in the American government. It was an escape hatch disguised as a promotion. Mellon accepted. On the 12th of February, 1932, 1 month and 6 days after Patman's impeachment speech, Andrew Mellon resigned as Secretary of the Treasury. He had served 10 years and 11 months, the third longest tenure of any Treasury Secretary in American history. The impeachment proceedings, deprived of their target, were discontinued. Hoover's letter accepting the resignation praised the 11 years of service. Mellon had given the country and spoke of the universal expressions of the press and the public toward you. The universal expression of the public, by that point, was the rhyme on the urinal wall. The scale of the damage that the crash and the Depression had inflicted by the time Andrew Mellon left Washington is worth measuring against the prosperity he had claimed to have created. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had reached 381 points in September of 1929, would fall to 41 points by July of 1932, a decline of nearly 90%. Industrial production dropped by more than half. 12 million Americans were unemployed, 1 in 4 workers in the labor force. More than 5,000 banks had failed, wiping out the savings of millions of depositors who had no federal insurance to protect them. Farm income fell by 60%. National income, which had stood at $87 billion in 1929, fell to $40 billion by 1932. The gross national product contracted by nearly a third. Construction spending fell by more than 80%. International trade, burdened by the Smoot-Hawley tariff that Hoover had signed over the objections of 1,000 economists, collapsed to a fraction of its pre-crash volume. The national debt, which Mellon had spent a decade reducing, began to climb again and would continue climbing for the next 15 years. The man who had been celebrated as the architect of American prosperity was departing for a London ambassadorship that would last less than a year, escorted out of the capital under the threat of impeachment, leaving behind a country that bore almost no resemblance to the one he had promised his tax policies would produce. The ambassadorship was brief and largely ceremonial. Mellon attended court functions, dined with British officials, and spent much of his time in the galleries of London, studying paintings with the same intensity he had once applied to balance sheets. He returned to the United States in 1933, 77 years old, and visibly diminished. The new president of the United States was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had taken office in March with a mandate to remake the American economy, and who had once described Andrew Mellon as the mastermind among the malefactors of great wealth. Roosevelt was not finished with him. The reckoning was not over. Andrew Mellon had been collecting art since the years of the First World War. The habit began modestly, with purchases from New York galleries during his periodic visits to the city, and grew into something closer to an obsession as his wealth expanded and his marriage collapsed. Collecting offered Mellon what Pittsburgh society could not, and what Nora had refused to provide, which was a private world of beauty and refinement that answered to no one's judgment but his own. He studied paintings the way he studied balance sheets, with intense concentration and an appetite for quality that tolerated no compromise. He bought only masterworks. He dealt through Knoedler and Company, the most prestigious art dealers in New York, and he conducted his acquisitions with the same secrecy that governed every other dimension of his life. The most remarkable of those acquisitions took place between 1930 and 1931, during the years Mellon was simultaneously serving as Secretary of the Treasury and then as ambassador to the Court of St. James. The Soviet Union, desperate for foreign currency to finance the rapid industrialization ordered under Stalin's first five-year plan, had begun secretly selling masterworks from the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad. The imperial collection, assembled over centuries by the Romanov dynasty and seized by the Bolsheviks after the revolution, contained some of the finest paintings in the Western world. The Soviet government, having already sold off seized jewelry, furniture, and icons, turned to the Hermitage as a final source of hard currency. Mellon learned of the secret sales through Knoedler and Company, and he moved with the same calculated precision that had characterized his acquisition of ALCOA and Gulf Oil. Over the course of approximately 18 months, he purchased 21 paintings from the Hermitage collection, conducting the transactions through intermediaries to avoid publicizing either the sales or his involvement in them. The works included Raphael's Alba Madonna, a tondo of the Virgin and Child, considered one of the finest Renaissance paintings in existence, for which Mellon paid more than $1 million. A Jan van Eyck Annunciation dating to approximately 1434. A Botticelli Adoration of the Magi. A Perugino Crucifixion Triptych. Works by Titian, Veronese, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck completed the Hermitage purchases. The total price Mellon paid for the 21 paintings has been estimated at approximately $7 million, a sum that represented a fraction of their cultural value, and that the Soviet government accepted because it had no alternative. Mellon denied the purchases publicly for years. The full scope of the Hermitage acquisitions would not be confirmed until he disclosed his collection in his offer to build the National Gallery. The irony of the transaction was comprehensive. The Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and subsequently its ambassador to Great Britain, was secretly purchasing art from the government of a nation that the United States did not formally recognize. The monopolist, who had spent a decade arguing that private capital should be left undisturbed by government, was buying masterworks from a communist regime that had confiscated them from their private owners. Mellon justified the purchases to himself, according to his biographer David Cannadine, by reasoning that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had stolen the art from the Russian people, and that preserving the paintings in America was both prudent and just. The reasoning was characteristically Mellon. It was logical, self-serving, and delivered without a trace of self-awareness. The paintings became the nucleus of a much larger ambition. Mellon had conceived, during his years in Washington, the idea of building a national art gallery on the Mall, modeled on the National Gallery in London, that would serve as a permanent gift from private capital to the American public. The gallery would demonstrate what Mellon had always believed, and what his tax policies had been designed to prove, that wealth left to compound in private hands would ultimately produce a public benefit greater than any the government could achieve through taxation. But the gallery would have to wait. In 1934, the Roosevelt administration turned the machinery of the federal government against Andrew Mellon with a directness that recalled Mellon's own use of the same machinery during the 1920s. Historians have found no documents explaining the precise origins of the decision to pursue Mellon, but Roosevelt's description of him as the mastermind among the malefactors of great wealth suggested a hostility that was both political and personal. Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, ordered the Internal Revenue Service to investigate Mellon's tax returns. Elmer Lincoln Eyre, head of the Treasury Department's Criminal Tax Enforcement Division, later claimed that he had been ordered to file charges against Mellon, even though the evidence did not support them. A federal grand jury was convened in Pittsburgh to consider criminal fraud charges. The jury declined to indict by a vote of 11 to 10, one vote short of the majority required. But the IRS was not finished. It pursued a civil case against Mellon, claiming at least $3 million in back taxes and alleging that charitable deductions Mellon had taken for art donations were fraudulent. The former Commissioner of Internal Revenue, David Blair, would later call the investigation unwarranted abuse by high officials of the government. The trial before the Board of Tax Appeals began in Pittsburgh and moved to Washington. It lasted 14 months. The government's case was led by Robert Howhout Jackson, an attorney from Western New York, who would later serve as Attorney General of the United States, as a Justice of the Supreme Court, and as the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Jackson was, in 1935, a rising figure in the Roosevelt administration, and the Mellon case was among the most prominent assignments of his early career. He argued that Mellon had used charitable trusts and art donations to shield income from taxation while retaining control of the assets he claimed to have given away. Mellon, 79 years old and visibly diminished, sat in the witness chair in Pittsburgh and answered Jackson's questions with the same flat precision he had brought to every transaction of his career. He did not raise his voice. He did not display emotion. He treated the proceedings as he treated everything, as a problem of arithmetic and documentation, to be resolved through the careful presentation of ledgers and balance sheets. During the trial in 1936, Mellon arranged a private meeting with President Roosevelt. At the meeting, he offered to build the National Gallery of Art at his own expense, to donate his entire collection, including the Hermitage paintings, and to establish an endowment for the museum's perpetual operation, all at no cost to the federal government. Roosevelt accepted the offer, but he instructed federal prosecutors to make, in the words of Mellon's biographer, no change whatsoever in the government's position on the tax case. The gift and the prosecution would proceed simultaneously. The National Gallery that Mellon proposed would be built of pink Tennessee marble, in 7 graduated shades from rose at the base to near white at the cornice. The architect, John Russell Pope, had designed the Jefferson Memorial and the National Archives building. The structure would measure 780 feet in length, making it one of the largest marble buildings in the world. Its central rotunda would be modeled on the interior of the Pantheon in Rome. Mellon's initial gift would comprise 126 paintings and 26 sculptures, 152 works in all. He insisted that the gallery bear not his own name, but the name of the nation. It would be called, simply, the National Gallery of Art. Andrew Mellon and John Russell Pope died within 24 hours of each other in August of 1937. Mellon was 82 years old. He died on the 26th of August at his home in Southampton, New York, of complications related to uremia and pneumonia. The tax case, which had consumed the final years of his life, died with him. The Board of Tax Appeals ultimately rejected the government's claim of fraud, though a smaller deficiency was assessed against the estate. The National Gallery of Art opened on the 17th of March, 1941. More than 8,000 visitors attended the dedication ceremony on the National Mall. Paul Mellon, Andrew's son, presented the gallery to the nation on behalf of his father. President Roosevelt formally accepted the gift for the American people. Thomas Mellon had read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography at 14 in a farmhouse near Poverty Point and decided to leave the soil for the city, because Franklin had shown him that a poor boy's ambition, compounded over a lifetime, could produce something permanent. 80 years later, his son had built a monument on the National Mall in Washington from Tennessee marble, filled it with Raphaels and Rembrandts purchased from a collapsing empire, and offered it to the nation as proof of the same proposition. Whether the gallery proved the point or merely decorated it was not a question the Mellons had ever asked. The marble offered no answer. The gallery opened without him. Andrew Mellon left behind 2 children, a monopoly, an art gallery, and a fortune that would reshape American politics and philanthropy for the rest of the 20th century. The children took different paths. The monopoly was broken. The fortune divided, compounded, and dispersed across institutions, foundations, and political movements that Thomas Mellon, reading Franklin's autobiography in a farmhouse near Poverty Point, could not have foreseen. Ailsa Mellon, Andrew's daughter, had served as her father's official hostess in Washington for more than a decade and had absorbed, along with his wealth, his instinct for privacy. In 1926, she married David K. E. Bruce, a diplomat who would later serve as ambassador to France, to West Germany, and to the court of St. James. The marriage ended in divorce in 1945. Ailsa established the Avalon Foundation, one of the largest charitable trusts in the country, and spent her remaining years in near-total seclusion, managing an inheritance that placed her among the wealthiest women in the world. She died in 1969 at the age of 68 in New York City. Paul Mellon, Andrew's son, was in almost every respect the opposite of his father. Where Andrew had been silent, calculating, and consumed by the mechanisms of accumulation, Paul was gentle, bookish, and drawn to the things that money could sustain, rather than the process of acquiring it. He attended Yale and Cambridge, studied with the psychologist Carl Jung in Switzerland, and returned to the Virginia countryside, where he purchased thousands of acres of rolling farmland and built a life centered on 2 passions that Andrew Mellon would have found bewildering in their impracticality. The first was arty. Paul donated thousands of works to the National Gallery of Art, to the Yale Center for British Art, which he founded and endowed, and to museums across the country, assembling one of the most generous records of private cultural philanthropy in American history. He gave with an openness and a lack of strategic calculation that would have been foreign to his father's temperament. The second was horse racing. Paul Mellon, became the most distinguished thoroughbred owner of his generation, breeding and racing champions on both sides of the Atlantic. His Virginia-bred colt Mill Reef won the Epsom Derby and the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. He remains the only individual ever to have won the Kentucky Derby, the Epsom Derby, and the Arc. He titled his autobiography Reflections in a Silver Spoon, a phrase that acknowledged, with a self-awareness his father had never possessed, the difference between earning a fortune and inheriting one. He died in 1999, at the age of 91. On the other branch of the family, Richard King Mellon, the son of Andrew's brother, Richard Beatty Mellon, inherited the industrial and financial side of the empire. He assumed control of Mellon National Bank when his father died in 1933, served as a three-star lieutenant general in the United States Army during the Second World War, and returned to Pittsburgh to lead the city's post-war urban renewal, a program known as the Pittsburgh Renaissance that demolished the old industrial core of smoke-blackened buildings and railroad yards and replaced them with office towers, parks, and highways. The Renaissance was, in its way, the final Mellon construction project, the last attempt to remake a city in the image of the family's ambitions. Richard King Mellon was the family's last empire builder, the last Mellon who operated on the scale and with the temperament of the founder. He died in 1970 at his estate in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. Richard King Mellon's sister, Sarah Mellon, married Alan Scaife of Pittsburgh and produced a son named Richard Mellon Scaife. Scaife, born in 1932, inherited his share of the Mellon fortune and devoted it to a cause that would have puzzled Thomas Mellon's Presbyterian severity and horrified Andrew Mellon's instinct for anonymity. Scaife became the most important private financier of the American conservative movement in the second half of the 20th century. He funded think tanks, policy institutes, and investigative journalism operations that promoted libertarian and free market ideas. He purchased the Pittsburgh Tribune Review and used it as a platform for conservative editorial positions. And in the 1990s, he helped fund the political and legal machinery that drove the impeachment of President William Jefferson Clinton. A second impeachment powered by Melton money 66 years after the first. While the heirs dispersed, the monopoly that had built the fortune faced its final reckoning. In April 1937, the same month that Andrew Mellon was dying in Southampton, the Department of Justice filed a new antitrust suit against the Aluminum Company of America, charging illegal monopolization and demanding that the company be dissolved. The trial began on June 1, 1938, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. It continued with few interruptions until August 14, 1940, producing 58,000 pages of trial record and becoming the longest trial in the history of the American federal court system. Federal Judge Francis Gordon Caffey spent 10 days reading his opinion aloud from the bench, filling 737 stenographic pages. He dismissed all of the government's charges, finding that ALCOA had achieved its monopoly through fair and efficient business practices, not through predatory conduct. The government appealed to the Supreme Court, but the case that would dismantle the Mellon monopoly arrived at the court in a condition that no one had anticipated. So many of the sitting justices had been involved as lawyers in earlier stages of the ALCOA litigation that the court could not assemble the quorum of 6 justices required to hear the appeal. Congress, in an act without precedent, authorized the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit to hear the case in the Supreme Court's place. A 3-judge panel, led by Judge Learned Hand, one of the most respected jurists in American legal history, took up the appeal. On March 12, 1945, as Allied troops prepared for the final offensive in Germany, and as Congress prepared to ratify the Bretton Woods Agreement that would reshape the international monetary system, Judge Hand delivered an opinion that reversed Scaife's ruling and declared ALCOA guilty of monopolization under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Hand rejected the standard that courts had applied since the landmark Standard Oil decision of 1911, the so-called rule of reason that required proof of predatory intent or overt bad acts. In Hand's formulation, monopoly itself, regardless of how it was achieved or how benignly it was exercised, violated the law if the monopolist had actively maintained its dominance by absorbing every opportunity for growth before a competitor could reach it. "We can think of no more effective exclusion," Hand wrote, "than progressively to embrace each new opportunity as it opened, and to face every newcomer with new capacity already geared into a great organization." The description matched with surgical precision the strategy that Andrew Mellon had employed since 1889. The quiet, structural, non-predatory monopoly that the Mellons had built, the fortress of vertical integration that needed no patents and no price wars to maintain itself, was exactly the kind of monopoly that Learned Hand declared illegal. The ruling broke the Mellon aluminum monopoly. The Second World War had already undermined ALCOA's practical dominance as the Defense Plant Corporation built $500 million in new aluminum capacity that was sold after the war to competitors including Kaiser Aluminum and Reynolds Metals. By 1950, the American aluminum industry had three major producers where it had once had one. The Learned Hand decision became the most important antitrust ruling of the 20th century, cited in hundreds of subsequent cases and enshrined in law school curricula as the definitive statement on the legal limits of monopoly power. The scale of what the Mellon family built and what became of it is worth one final accounting. Gulf Oil was sold to the Chevron Corporation in 1984 for $13.3 billion. Mellon National Bank merged with the Bank of New York in 2007, forming BNY Mellon, a financial services corporation with assets under management exceeding $1 trillion. ALCOA, stripped of its monopoly and forced to compete, remains a publicly traded company headquartered in Pittsburgh. The National Gallery of Art houses more than 150,000 works and draws more than 4 million visitors each year. In 1957, when Fortune magazine prepared its first list of the wealthiest Americans, it estimated that Paul Mellon, Ailsa Mellon Bruce, Sarah Mellon Scaife, and Richard King Mellon were all among the 8 richest people in the United States, each worth between $400 million and $700 million. The combined Mellon family fortune in the 21st century has been estimated at approximately $11.5 billion. The family that Thomas Mellon founded from a farmhouse in County Tyrone produced a Treasury secretary, a 3-star general, a Kentucky Derby winner, and 2 impeachments. The building on the mall remains. The name on the bank has been absorbed. The monopoly is gone. The fortune persists in the way that large American fortunes persist, not as an empire, but as a network of foundations, endowments, and trusts. The architecture of power translated into the architecture of giving. Whether the translation redeems the original construction is not a question the marble answers. The shadow remains.